Good morning from New Zealand. Kia ora and welcome. My name is Cameron Douglas. I'm a Master Sommelier and I'm here to host and moderate today's session. And we're all coming to you from New Zealand, everybody on screen. And we're here to talk about soils, the soil makeup of New Zealand and its influences on that wonderful grape variety that we all love called Pinot Noir. Today's session is part of the New Zealand Wine Week, and with me I have an illustrious group of people that I'd like to introduce to you now. Helen Masters from Atarangi Wines in the Wairarapa. Helen, if you could just say, wave, and there she is. Fantastic.
Hi, everybody.
Jen Parr from Central Otago and North Otago. Jen.
Morning or afternoon.
Natalie Christensen, who's coming to us from Marlborough today, part of the Yellens group. Morning, Natalie.
Good morning.
And Mr. Dom Maxwell, who is Greystone Wines, coming to us,
Hi,
he works in North Canterbury, but is actually sitting in Wellington today. And I forgot to mention Jen's with Varley Wines. Working in the background is a gentleman called Madison, and he's going to bring up some pictures for us as our speakers want to talk to you about that. And we also have the opportunity for you to send us some questions, which will be channeled to me. And if I don't get the chance to address those questions or pass them on to the panel, rest assured they will be answered in due course after today's session. So let's begin. Wine is made in the vineyard, arguably made in the vineyard, and it starts with the soil. And what we're going to try and do today is take a deeper dive, a further examination of the soils of New Zealand and the influences that they have on Pinot Noir. It is suggested and written that the soils of New Zealand are approximately 42 million years old. And for some that is considered youthful, but offers New Zealand viticulture in a very particular setting. It is unique. And as vignerons, the people on screen are not bound by rules that may be enforced in the Northern Hemisphere. We can literally plant what we want, where we want. And so long as we meet the legislation for winemaking, where we can just literally do what we want to do. New Zealand wine growers in the background do invest in the research of New Zealand soils and have spent about $7 million recently on that research to really connect the environment and understand how everything works, from what goes on under the ground to yeast populations and the way in which the holistic vineyard approach looks. So we're going to focus on Pinot Noir and the relationship with the differing soils that we have throughout Aotearoa, New Zealand. And hopefully we'll touch on the topics of regenerative agriculture and the custodial direction that we all seem to be moving towards and embracing here in Aotearoa. I'd like Madison, if you could bring up the map of New Zealand, please. Here it comes. Oh, okay. Just a simple map of New Zealand to remind all the people tuned in today how maritime influenced we are, and really quite a skinny country that New Zealand is. And generally speaking, moving from Northland to South, there are no big mountains or hills up there in Northland, and the soils that are mainly predominate there are clay-based, brown clays, red clays, yellow clays, with some volcanic residues and lots of sand. As we move down to Auckland, the isthmus between the Tasman Sea, which is where all our prevailing weather comes from, and the Pacific Ocean off to the east, is a mix of soils. 54 dormant volcanoes exist in Auckland alone, and we have Again, a lot of clay, some sand and sub-volcanic structures in there. We'll bypass the Waikato and Bay of Plenty, but that is essentially a clay-ridden area with a lot of moisture in the soil, very healthy soils down there. Moving into Gisborne, generally speaking, this is got quite a few soils here, and this is where things start to change in terms of viticulture, where we have, again, more clay, but we're starting to see more stone, river residues and fracturing of limestone throughout the soil. Hawke's Bay, major wine producing region for us, has around 27 different soil types, from red clays to river deposits to boulders in places, but 27 different soil types, and the viticulture is spread throughout the entire region. Moving down to the Wairarapa, I'm going to hand over to Helen shortly to talk about that. And one area that we don't have a representative of at the moment is Nelson, but I'll talk a little bit about that when we get to one of the questions, and that I'll address with Natalie, and draw some of the similarities between Nelson and Marlborough together. Madison, if you could just bring up the picture, which I called the lead slide, just a picture of some limestone with a little in my hand, actually. That's the one. That's the one. So this is a piece of limestone weathered soil that I picked up out of a vineyard a number of years ago, and I just wanted to remind everybody of the inextricable link that we have between viticulture and the soil. And even if we zoomed in on that, you could see the root system of this vine worked its way not only through the stone but out the other side. And so there is a strong link between soil below the ground and environment above the ground. So Helen, when it comes to New Zealand soil makeup, we are literally have to work with what we're given. We can't change that. Can you please describe for our listeners the features of the soils where you work in the Wairarapa? If there's any particular combinations, can you describe them for us, and perhaps the influence on your winemaking, please? Helen. Oh, you need to turn on your microphone, please, Helen. Oh, Madison, Helen's microphone's not on. Oh.
Get myself cool. If we start with the map of the Wairarapa, I think that's a really good place to kind of understand how it all started for us. So we just pull that first map up. I think it's coming. We can really have a kind of a look at, I guess, a lot of New Zealand was originally under the sea, and Cameron's talked about 42 million years ago. And if we have a look at this map, we have a valley which we're in, the Wairarapa Valley, and this was part of the seabed when all around this tip of the North Island was under the sea. And what's really interesting, I guess, as a starting point, is if you go in the hills around us, you can see the distinct layers of where the shell deposits are. So it's kind of the starting base, is that this was a seabed. And then about 20 million years ago, after we had been risen from out of the sea, basically the valley of where we are and up the whole valley, the wine growing region was formed by the Rumahanga River. So in New Zealand, I don't know if you've spent much time here, the idea of a water source and water is incredibly important to the Māori people. And the Rumahanga River ends up being kind of like our kind of spiritual river in the Wairarapa, and it links all our distinct little wine growing regions. So about 20 million years ago, we had an exposure of the seabed matter, and then the river came through, pushing through different sandstone gravels, and then also fine bits of clay which banked up to form the river terrace. And so it's incredibly stony, mostly a sandstone called greywacke, but also all the fines that are between those stones are sedimentary matter, so have a lot of crustaceans, a lot of shells, and that's kind of where we get our mineral content from for the vines. So if we pull up the map, the one that just says image Madison will show the kind of typical soil that we're growing on in Martinborough. And you can kind of see what kind of creates the magic in our region. All right, here it is. We've even got a poor sacrificial vine here. This really shows how that river formed this terrace about 20 million years ago. And the rocks are incredibly important for free draining, and especially Pinot Noir needs a reasonably free draining environment. But all the fine matter that's between these stones is incredibly important as a nutrient source for the vine. We have a small amount of quartz threaded through the sandstone and only a very, very small amount of sort of volcanic basalt. So it's typically the sandstone mix with fine crustacean matter that gives us this environment. And I think for us here, you know, we are on alluvial soils. Most of New Zealand is based around this idea of soil that has been moved by water. And I think it's kind of, in a way, become part of who we are as New Zealanders, that we kind of think in terms of river terraces. And once you've been here for a little bit in terms of how the Māori think about rivers and how important they are for sustaining life, it kind of all starts to fit together as part of who we are. So Madison, if we could have a look at the other soil profile, we can kind of see the kind of variation that we have even within our distinct valley. I think the biggest variation between parcels that comes through in the wine is the content of clay. And clay is incredibly important in terms of, mainly in simplistic terms, of its water holding potential. So you can see here on this site, there's a layer of quite fine clay, and then underneath it about 30 metres of very, very fine grained gravels here. Further up the valley, closer to Masterton, the stones are much bigger, but as they're being pushed further down towards Martinborough, they're much smaller, and that's just through that action of that terrace being formed. So in terms of wines in the region and distinct differences, yes, you have climatically, we're very maritime, we have the cool southern breeze coming up, but what we're really discovering, you know, now that we've been planting 40 years, is this influence of clay coming through and spreading through the gravels and how that impacts on certain particular blocks. And clay, I guess, being holding more water, you get more evaporation, so the soil is much cooler, and so distinctly different kind of aromatics and texture. And especially, I think, in a year where it's warmer, the clay often, as some of the sites that we prefer. In the cooler, wetter years, it's often the very, very free draining sites that we saw in the previous picture that really give us the wines that shine in that vintage. And clay also gives a more textural kind of slightly wider character, slightly smoother flow to the palate rather than the taut and linear aspect that the gravels, the sandstone greywacke often brings.
Thank you, Helen. I just looking at that picture there, I can see and I can tell that the taproot of a vine can move quite easily through that soil to work its way down to any moisture that might be there and any nutrients. But I'm wondering, Jen, if you could contrast that with the soils that you have to manage in both Central and North Otago, because of the makeup of the soil, I imagine that it's a little bit more difficult for vines to get established there. Can you walk us through what you're managing?
Yeah, well, I guess within Central Otago, we have well, 6+ subregions, and they all vary in terms of their soil profile. And what I'll touch on a bit later is why the soil profiles are different is largely when and how they're formed. So the vine age or the soil age. But clay takes a lot of time. So whilst there is a level of clay in some areas in Central Otago, because the landscape and the soil profiles are younger, we haven't had as much time to accumulate that finer particle. One thing that was interesting to me with Helen talking as I was thinking about the clone Abel that sort of found its home originally in Martinborough and has found its way down to Central Otago, where we're growing it in very different climate as well as very different soils. But the example that came to mind is our Bendigo vineyard, where Abel is a very important clone. And it was planted on the older part. So this is a 700,000-year-old terrace. So one of the oldest where the grapes are grown in Central Otago. And that is an area where there is a little bit more clay. However, beneath that and down the slope, it's very, very free draining. So when Helen talks about how clay affects the texture of her wine from the same clone, bit older vines, I think about that it definitely affects tannin and texture in our wine, but quite differently. So I guess my point is that when you are talking about soils, even if you have similar soils, when you put climate, soil age and everything into it, you can plant and make a wine in a very similar way, and you're still going to have a different character in that wine. So it's not as simple as saying that, you know, grapes grown on clay or grapes grown on loam or with more loess or limestone give a wine like this. Because I think we could also talk about the Dom in North Canterbury compared to the Waitaki, where there is a lot of marine fossil limestone, and I'll talk more about limestone later. The wines would have a characteristic that is familiar, but they would also be very different, and that would again go to vine age and climate. So to me, talking about soil and isolation of climate from a Otago perspective is very, I can't do it. I think you have to take climate into account.
Yeah. Can I just interject there, Jen and Helen together? Does the questions come through, would you use the same rootstock for, say, the Abel clone, regardless of soil? Do you have the power to change that? Jen?
You go, Jen.
All I was going to say is where in our vineyard, Bendigo vineyard, which was planted in 2005, they were aware in this, it's a terrace that slopes from 374 meters down to 314 meters. And again, this is in the older soils in Central Otago, which are still incredibly young. And at the bottom where they have what they call these Clyde series soils, which came from closer. So the glacier was closer and brought more of these sandy sort of soils. They planted two different clones, the 777 and 667. However, as you go up the slope, where I mentioned there was more clay, it's a bit older, and it was the Alexandra soils, so that came from further away. So by the time the glacier receded, there was less deposit up there. They planted Abel 115 and Clone 5. However, they used the same rootstock for all of those clones, but they did take into account soils for clonal differences. So I can't comment further on the rootstock, but that was their decision. They thought it was the right rootstock, and it was more of a clonal question.
Thank you. Helen, for you?
Yeah, I guess the gravels can be much tougher on the vine, so we do tend to try and use a slightly more vigorous rootstock. You know, in the early days, it was all about devigoration, but actually in Martinborough, we struggle a little bit with vigor. So we definitely, if it's very, very free draining, go for a more vigorous rootstock. Where there's a little bit more clay content, we can go for a more moderate rootstock.
Okay, thank you very much. Could we move to North Canterbury? Dom, can you walk us through really what soils that we have to deal with there, the vignerons of the region, and maybe some of the key influences they have for you?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so North Canterbury is a valley. Well, the Waipara part of North Canterbury is a valley, open to the south, and we're really dealing with simply put, 3 main soil types, but often there's combinations of those. So as you come into the start of the valley from the south, you hit the gravels, so known as the Glasnevin gravels. There's still a river that flows through that part of Waipara, and a long time ago there was more water flowing through there, more gravels that have been put down from the mountains. So that forms really the plains and the initial part of the valley. As you go deeper into the valley, heading north, you start to get clay over gravels, and then definitely more clay dominant soils. And then as you start to go up the hillside, you start to get into limestone with sandstone influence as well. But like I was saying, there's often combinations of those soils together. And it is interesting. The rootstock thing is interesting as well. Like, it's quite a complicated sort of equation to work out, and it really depends on you know, your philosophy, I guess, the wines you want to make. What in general we see in our area is that we see aromatics performing very well, very strongly on the gravels. So quite crystal-like and precise flavours, and lovely integrated acidity, and perhaps the Pinot Noirs in our area on gravels show tannin that's a little more edgy. As we start to move into clay, I totally agree with what Helen and Jen were saying. You know, we see clay as giving density to the wines. You know, clay has very high suction, so it doesn't give up a lot of water, but it will hold plenty of water. So therefore, it's very good at moderating within times of moderate rainfall, that is, moderating how much water the vines get. So we end up with quite concentrated grapes on the clay soils. And then as you start to move up into the limestone, higher up on the hillsides, that limestone really gives a length to the wine. So certainly a lot of Pinot Noir planted around the clays and parts of limestone and parts of the gravels, but parts of limestone and parts of gravel are also used extensively for white grapes as well.
Tom, can I ask, I know that there are pockets of really pure, quite active limestone in North Canterbury. Does the clonal selection of Pinot Noir, is that determined by how focused or concentrated limestone is, or is Pinot Noir a little bit more forgiving regardless of soil there?
Yeah, so you're right. So further inland near Waikari, very small settlement. There's 2 or 3 vineyards there that are on that limestone, and those wines really show that. They show quite an exquisite length. Yeah, to be honest, like I think they have a mixture of clones. What has been a focus for them is rootstock, particularly if I'm thinking of the Bell Hill vineyard. You know, very high limestone content, and so rootstock has been very important. You know, otherwise you're dealing with lime chlorosis, and the vines don't survive. So it's really about selecting the most limestone tolerant rootstock, and that's important for good canopy growth, and then, you know, ripening the grapes.
Thank you very much. Natalie, I need to jump to you now, please, because you're in Marlborough, and there is some measure of clay soil throughout New Zealand, as we're learning, and you know, to a greater or lesser degree in terms of concentration. And when it comes to, say, Nelson, and where you have viticulture with Yellens in the AUT Valley, can you walk us through really, it really is a very, very different makeup of soil, because you also have a lot of exposure to the influences of the ocean and sea breeze and salt spray and all sorts of different challenges. Can you tell us really about AUT Valley and maybe Marlborough in general from your perspective, so that we can contrast that to what we've heard so far? Natalie.
Yeah, sure. I guess for those online who don't know the Marlborough region too well, it's two parallel valleys. We've got the Wairau and the Awatere, and the Awatere is a little bit more southern and a little bit cooler. The Wairau Valley built up from the Wairau River and its tributaries, so very much an old braided river, very alluvial. And then there's the Southern Valleys region, which is kind of the band of valleys that separates the Wairau from the Awatere, and that's where we get our predominant clay soils, and it's a very popular region for us to plant our Pinot Noir. One of the things about, I guess, the Wairau Valley, just years and years of flooding. It used to be almost like a floodplain, so there was a lot of swamps through there. There's a lot of really deep, fertile silt pockets, which is magical terrain for Sauvignon Blanc. So areas of Marlborough that are really amazing for Sauvignon definitely aren't amazing for Pinot Noir. So hugely vigorous, which we don't really want for Pinot Noir, but it's perfect for that really sort of bright crisp Sauvignon that we get out of here. And then moving to my home, where I work in the Awatere Valley, it's a lot cooler and it's a lot drier. We're incredibly windy. We do get salt spray, and another really defining feature, I guess, of Marlborough in general are our fault lines. So there's the Wairau Fault, the Awatere Fault, and the Clarence Fault, which are all part of the Alpine Fault. And as Helen touched on earlier about how we used to be under the ocean, that's very much true for us as well. So in the Awatere, we have a stone or a rock, which is papa, which is this purple, very marine sediment, very, very dense, very alkaline, and that has a lot of influence on our soil structure. The Awatere Valley is very diverse from the start to the end. So the fruit that we tend to get from the Seaview site right on the coast, really harsh growing conditions, incredibly dry, massive transevaporation rate. That's one of the key things about the Awatere. Basically, the soils are hydrophobic. They hate water. And so there's no surprise that we've got our national salt works, which is just down the road from us. So yeah, high amounts of evaporation. And the Pinot Noir that we tend to get on the more coastal sites with those sort of salty soils, very much, they struggle. They are thicker skins, so there's a lot of colour and a lot of flavour in those skins, but they're more of that kind of spicy, lifted aromatic, whereas the southern valleys where we've got the clay content, it's really interesting hearing actually the guys from the other regions. There is a similarity, and it's that really dense, deep sort of, talking to a few winemakers, they like to describe it as sort of a velvety texture that we get from the southern valleys. Sort of deeper up the Awatere, there are silted river terraces, silted river terraces, which can be quite fertile, but also free draining. So it really depends on how the season's going. But there's certain ways, I think Pinot Noir, it is managed in the vineyard a lot, and when you do see vigor, there's certain things that you can do to moderate that. But the Taylor Pass area and also sort of that mid-Awatere region, you get very silky fine tannins and very sort of feminine lifted styles, and can be layered in with some nice green sort of spicy aromatics. And then deeper in the Awatere, very massive diurnal shifts, very extreme sort of growing conditions, big rocky soils, and there's that impenetrable papa portion sort of under the vineyard. So very dry, very hard.
Yeah, Natalie, you submitted 2 pictures. I'm just wondering if you could call Madison to call up one in particular, because you spoke to me yesterday about the contrast of soils and how Pinot Noir behaves on that.
Yeah.
And yeah, is there one that you can bring up? And I have a question from a listener for you as well once you've got those up.
Ooh, okay, great. Look forward to that. We might bring up, we might talk about the clays actually. So there's a picture of someone holding some, or down by a vine by some clay. So this is actually from the Claven Vineyard. Thank you, Geeson. I robbed it from your website. I hope you don't mind, but I'm sure it's all good. But it just shows that It's really interesting. So I guess a little bit about soil and sort of holding capacity. We've talked about the water holding capacity, and clay also has an amazing nutrient holding capacity. So you've got basically from particle size, you've got your big rocks, can't hold anything. Then you've got sand, barely any sort of holding capacity. And then you get into silts, which can release quite well. And then you get into the clays, which are they massive holding capacity, but it does like to hold on. So the vines do struggle. And so, yeah, it's these sites in the southern valleys that we do get those sort of plush, dense styles of Pinot.
So maybe I can interject with the question, and then you can bring up the other slide, because it is soil related, and it's probably something we can throw to everybody as well. But Natalie, when blending, are you choosing the blend due to the soils or the types of clones used? And I know that we talked about that yesterday as well, how the soil does have an influence on those tannins, the softness, the ethereal parts of Pinot Noir. How does that work for you?
Yeah, not necessarily. I would be blending sort of based on more on soil and sort of microclimate of that certain vineyard. Clonal wise, we tend to use a lot of 667, 777, 115. So we would more or less, we have some similar clones at these different sites. So it's definitely more of a soil difference that we're seeing as opposed to a clonal difference. So I guess to answer your question, it's more site dependent than based solely on clones. But then also in different years, depending on the growing season, even the likes of 10 bar 5, which has traditionally been a Pinot Noir clone used for sparkling base, you get some really fleshy, delicious styles, but it can just be seasonal variation with that one.
Thank you. Madison, can you bring up Natalie's other slide, please?
Oh, this is actually a picture I took on my drive home from work yesterday. So anyone who's visited the Awatere Valley, this is just really under that Awatere Bridge. And so right by the river, and you can't really zoom in here, but basically we've got in that kind of coastal area in the Awatere, from sort of years and years of erosion, and it's quite a high elevation, we've got a very small area that we actually sort of can get our roots growing in. So there's very sort of thick rock underneath, and then we've got a very small sort of top layer of soil, which is windblown loose, and then there's a few sort of river gravels, but then it's very dense, and the soils just do not hold their moisture out there, and especially with those winds. I guess it's a bit like being out in the wind. You get dry, cracked lips. That's what's happening in these sort of harsh conditions on the coast. Very drying, so yeah, very extreme sort of situations for the poor wee Pinot vines out there. But Pinot likes a battle, so good.
Okay, thank you. Dom, a question's come through which I think I'd like you to address, please. And it says, what is meant by more active limestone? Because I use that term. And can you explain that versus, say, an inactive limestone?
I'll do my best, but other people can jump in as well. My understanding is that really the age of the limestone and the concentration of calcium carbonate in the soil has an effect on basically how that's translocated, I guess, so into plants in the soil. So you can look at high levels of calcium carbonate in the soil, and that will typically mean you have got, we call it active limestone, high levels of active limestone, and that is, yeah, very in a positive way contributes to the vines, and that's, looking at minerals from that limestone as well. What do you think from your limestone areas as well in Waitaki?
Yeah, Jen, that's a great segue, thank you, because North Otago and the Waitaki Valley is certainly well known for concentrations of limestone. Active or not, Jen?
Active. And I am not a soil scientist, and I actually asked a Frenchman about this, and he said, ooh, I've got an article in French. He couldn't explain really succinctly the difference between active and inactive limestone. But as I understand it, in our relevance in New Zealand, active limestone is limestone that comes from the weathering of marine fossils. And kind of the way I get it is sort of what Don was saying. It gives more nutrient back to the soil, particularly in a more arid environment where there's not as much leaching. So in an arid environment, things aren't being washed away. So the nutrients are more retained in the soil. So whereas in Central Otago, we also have calcium carbonate, but it's from pedogenic lime. And pedogenic simply means soil created. So in order to create pedogenic lime, you need a lot of time. And in Central Otago, the parent material is schist. So the older soils, which again are still very young, from say 700,000 years ago, will have possibly created more pedogenic lime. So effectively that schist material weathers down to calcium carbonate. So chemically it's exactly the same as calcareous or marine fossil limestone, but it comes from schist rather than marine fossils. So I think it gives different energy to the wine. So if you're dealing with a Central Otago subregion where there is pedogenic lime, and the pedogenic lime's way deep in the soil, so that's why it needs time. The energy is different to the Waitaki, but they both have that vibrance, that length, that sort of, Helen was talking about, focus as well.
Thank you. Can I come back to all of you? Actually, I want to start with Helen, then Natalie. Helen, there's a question that's come through, and does the soil affect canopy management? And if so, how do you manage that?
Absolutely, yeah. So I guess we touched on it before about choices of rootstock. So I guess in sites where it's very, very free draining, you tend to have very small canopies. So your choice might be when planting is to have a rootstock that's got reasonable vigor to help the vine grow a canopy, that enough leaf to ripen the fruit fully. And then slightly richer with more sort of lower or topsoil, you can get a bigger canopy structure. So one of the first things you do is try to match the vigor of the rootstock. I guess in terms of canopy management though, I think it depends on the season, as Jen touched on earlier. We are very windy here in the Wairarapa, so the wind can often be quite devigorating for the vine because the vine often can't respirate on very windy days. So it's a year-to-year thing in terms of how you manage the vine, and that's where a lot of the skill of the viticulturalist comes in, and trying to kind of get a sense of what perhaps our seasonal weather might be like, and then responding to that in terms of maybe you don't trim the vines because there's no vigor, or some seasons you might trim once, and in an extreme year maybe trim the canopy twice.
Natalie, what about for you with those two different subregions where Zealand's plant their Pinot Noir? How does that work in terms of canopy management against soil type?
Yeah, very similar to what Helen was saying. So basically those stonier soils, like we do have deeper up the Awatere, very free draining. The rootstock, very important, but also we do a lot of work with, there's a guy called Mark Krasno, and he measures the water potential actually in the leaf. So you can really monitor how stressed those vines are. Sometimes when you look at a vine, you can see they're stressing, and which is good for Pinot Noir, but it does, if you do get a lot of really, really early stress, that can actually be quite detrimental, and you can get quite blocky, bad tannin sort of coming through. But yeah, sort of really monitoring sort of your water usage if you do use irrigation. But we try to dry farm as much as we can with our Pinot Noir, especially in bigger sites where you really don't need anything. But yeah, it can be about leaf exposure as well. So when you're going into the harvest period, depending on how much canopy growth you've had, how much leaf you want to take off to get some sun exposure on those bunches. but yeah, it's definitely seasonal dependent, and yeah, varies every year.
Thank you. Dom, back to you for a second. Natalie just mentioned dry farming, and that reminded me that there is quite a bit of dry farming that happens in Gisborne because of the moisture content in the soil to a greater degree. Is there dry farming practiced where you are, and does the soil type and Pinot Noir respond to that?
Yeah, there is dry farming. There's also vineyards that are irrigated. The vineyards that are successful with their dry farming tend to be those with well-established vines. And you know, I'm thinking of a vineyard at the moment, Muddy Water Vineyard, that most of the Pinot Noirs on own roots, about 30 years old, and so that doesn't see any irrigation. But that's been a gradual process, and it hasn't been irrigated for a long time now. And what we see is the vines in balance, and so obviously we know the benefits of that. The roots are very deep, they're less susceptible to seasonal changes, very dry weather or very wet weather, so you get that benefit. But because they're in balance, you know, we go back to the canopy management. We also have to do less trimming, we have to do less leaf removal, because they gradually take up water as opposed to having flushes of growth, you know, right throughout the season. So, you know, there'll be other areas that are more fertile, and leaf will be removed, and then you'll go back a month later and there'll be more leaf in that fruiting zone. So, so dry farming has its benefits, yeah, and there are a few vineyards that are successfully dry farming. I know Black Estate do that as well. So yeah, it's exciting, and I think people are challenging themselves to get the best out of their vines and to really allow the vines to connect with the soil that we've planted on for really valid reasons. And often the most interesting soil is quite deep. And the best way to do that is to limit irrigation and to allow those roots to dive deep.
Thank you. Helen, some of the vines planted in the Wairarapa have some, significant age, and in terms of long-term plantings in New Zealand on that scale. And Dom mentioned balance in the vineyard, and there is a question that came through as well that I'm hoping you can address, and that is, because you're looking for this wonderful balance in the vineyard ultimately, is there a vine age, is there a tipping point for Pinot Noir where vine age and the soil relationship deliver something different, something more?
Yeah, I guess from my experience of what I've seen, I think that more gravelly sites need more time. We've got our oldest vines are now 40 years of age, and they're incredibly balanced. So we do no trimming whatsoever and very, very little leaf removal, if any, and need to not even thin, because the balance is so in place because of the root depth, as Dom talked about. Some of our sites which are on more gravels, it's taken almost 22 years for me to really think that I've cracked the vineyard in terms of, as young vines, they're incredibly tannic, and it's really taken that amount of time for those roots to get a lot deeper and to get more flow in terms of the palate. On clay, though, I think I've seen that happen a little earlier, almost like the wine is more balanced at around 15 years of age. So I think, site by site, if you farm on a piece of land long enough, you start to get a clear idea about how long those vines need to be to really kind of show what's deeper down in the soil. And so it is about getting to know the site, and it does change site to site. Yeah.
Jen, can you comment on that? Because you've got the benefit of working in Waitaki Valley as well as Central Otago and noting the age of vines. How does that work for you in terms of balance and that tipping point of harmony?
Prior to being at Valley, I worked with some of, well, the oldest plantings in Bannockburn. And at that point in time, they were in their, just had tipped over 20 years old. And to be honest, they hadn't arrived yet in terms of that balance and that having to do less. Although I believe nowadays less or little irrigation is required. In my world today, with Valley and the other vineyards I work with, we're approaching 20 years old. The Waitaki was formed as a region. The first plantings were in 2000. So some of those are approaching 20 years old. And for me, I found probably, you know, there's an exuberance. I always compare vine age to sort of human development. You know, sometimes first fruit off of vines gives you this amazing kind of innocence and exuberance that actually does age for 20 years in bottle, and no one can explain it because people often think young vines don't create wines that age. And then the next vintage, maybe it's something that lasted 3 years. So I think it's just like a young person in their evolution and changing and finding their way. However, after, and then the teenage years are perhaps the most erratic. There's an intelligence, there's kind of a beginning of an understanding. So there's the beginning of a profundity, but sometimes there isn't the depth to really understand what that means. And then you're getting into, you know, 20 would start to be, I guess, middle age in our world. And that's where, you know, it's almost more confusing because what you know then throws you a season that is entirely different from what you had believed. So I haven't got my mind around it yet, except that there is, let's put it pragmatically, I'm much more comfortable with the inclusion of whole clusters in vines that are a bit older. And that I think is because, you know, when you're putting the stock into a ferment, it's taking in part everything that plant is imparting, and it's giving more, and it's giving, you know, the roots are more, are deeper, and the stalks, I think, taste riper and give a better quality of tannin. So it does come into play pragmatically when I'm addressing how to approach a part of a site. But I don't think at 20 years old, in my experience, you know, give me another 10 years and I'll probably have more light bulb moments like Helen has had.
Thank you. Natalie, another question's come through, and I know the answer to this for all the people on screen in part, and that is that I know that you've all worked overseas and you've done vintages elsewhere in the world. What about working with Pinot Noir overseas? How does that compare to, say, New Zealand?
So this is for me?
Yes, thank you, Nat.
Oh, cool. Yes, great. Yeah, well, I had an awesome time. I did a vintage in Oregon in 2010. And yeah, a lot of clay soils up there, working in the Willamette. But yeah, working, I guess, I mean, I was an intern over there, so I was just sort of learning from Melissa Burr, who's the winemaker there. Incredible experience. But yeah, different, I guess completely different sort of culture, and but I guess the new world, so very sort of scientific and along the lines of us. But Jen's probably the best to talk about Oregon. She's the Oregon fanatic. But for me, the take home for me were just sort of the culture that was there. I cried on my flight home, very sort of farm to fork kind of mentality, and that was sort of, I think New Zealand's sort of taken on that sort of culture now, but they were very, very connected to their land and sort of their surrounds and sort of the culture around wine. So.
Okay, Dom, what about you and Pinot Noir, working with Pinot Noir internationally? How does that compare to, say, New Zealand?
Yeah, well, working overseas with Pinot Noir for me was a revelation. You know, before I went, so I've worked in Oregon as well, in the Willamette, and I worked in Burgundy, and they were, you know, real moments of learning, I guess, especially Oregon, just as far as a learning experience. But what I got from Burgundy was probably something that added more to my overall understanding of vineyards, of soils, and the beauty of the land and how that can come through in wine. And it's a little bit hard to kind of read that or study that, but you know, you have to pinch yourself when you're in Clos de Vougeot adding a biodynamic prep at 5:30 in the morning. But the magic of it all hits you. And then when I got back to Greystone and I drove into the vineyard, and I just looked at our beautiful vineyard across the hillside, and it looked different to me from before I went away. And I needed that trip to get a deeper understanding of what a beautiful place we have, and what special soils and what special wines can be made from our place. And so that was obviously hundreds of years of tradition, caught up in a little snapshot for me, one harvest. But it was a really really important moment in my wine career. Yeah.
Thank you, Helen. I distinctly remember a sentence that you said in the Seat at the Table movie when you said the hairs on the back of your neck went up. How do I make that? I don't know if you recall that, and it was to do with Pinot Noir, and it was to do with the culture of terroir and soil and winemaking. And for us in New Zealand, we have that Turanga Waiwai, we have that relationship with our land. But what's your take on Pinot Noir, say from Burgundy compared to New Zealand? Does one influence the other for you?
Oh, absolutely. I think that we're all trying to discover what our voice is, and Burgundy's had a lot longer to do that. And so sometimes you try those wines and you really get a sense of, the history, and that they really understand their site. And I think that that's what's exciting about being in New Zealand. And just listening to Dom, I agree, coming back from overseas, you start to think about your own community differently. And I think to make great wine, it is in a community. And that's where that whole idea of, I guess, Turanga Waiwai, your place to stand, understanding where you are. And I think we're all going to make different styles in New Zealand, but I think once you settle in a place and start to dig deeper, I think that's when you start to create wines that are more exciting, and hopefully will put the hairs on the back of other people's necks, because there's a sense of clarity and a sense of focus. And maybe they're all different styles, and maybe there's a region you prefer, but I think as long as there's something that's compelling about that wine, I think then we're doing our job as caretakers, as stewards of the land. I guess that's what, I guess, that sense of Burgundy is, that they are caretakers of the land and have been for a long time, and will for future. And we're on that start of that journey.
Thank you, Jen. Every time I travel around New Zealand, which is quite a bit, I start to ask viticulturalists and winemakers alike about climate change. And the question is climate change having an effect on soil, and therefore is it having an effect on Pinot Noir? Is there a relationship that you are noticing this change now, or is it too soon?
It's a tricky question, because in the last 6 vintages, we've had such seasonality. So 2020 was the coldest vintage in my 7 years at Valley in its nature. And 19, whilst not as cold, we had some warm moments, is shaping up to be not far behind. So when you think of climate change, you think of it's going to increasingly bring warmer harvests, like what we saw in 2018. So 2018 in Central Otago and Waitaki was a month ahead. It was the first time since I've lived here, which is 14 years, where we had no diurnal range in summer. You didn't need to bring a fuzzy jumper to a barbecue, and you slept with your windows open, and normally you're freezing in a Central Otago summer. So that to me was what I would expect from climate change, and then we haven't seen it since. So I think there's a real erraticness at the moment that is part of that climate change, but it's not, things are getting warmer. So, we're harvesting earlier consistently, there's higher bricks, etc. And in fact, generally, we're seeing people harvesting at lower bricks. So sure, it is making a difference. But how do we explain these cooler harvests within that? I mean, I might just be simple, but when I think of warming and climate change, I think of a warmer nature to our vintages, and we've gone back to the crazy diurnal range. So yeah, I think we need a little bit more time to see. And then you see there's all these other factors with the rise of organic farming in Central Otago as well. I think we're up to about 30% as a region. So that's also going to be making an impact. So I don't think you can, again, look at climate in isolation either. But yeah, it's definitely something we think of. And in fact, with the Waitaki, Grant and I often marvel that, you know, it's the hardest region that we work in terms of being able to have a commercial yield. And it's, you know, sometimes like in 19, you get 0.75 ton to the hectare. And in 18, we got 6. And then normal is 2. But maybe the Waitaki, maybe we're way ahead of our game. And maybe that's the place to be because of the cooler climate. And, you know, we're there, and maybe in 10 years, we'll be able to tell you. But I don't know if I answered your question, but that's how I feel.
No, that's okay. You have actually started to answer the question. This is kind of for Natalie and Helen. Extreme weather events in New Zealand are becoming more common. We have powerful rains that are coming through. We have an unexpected frost in Nelson and hail in Nelson in the last few weeks, and that is must alter, you know, if we have extreme rain events, that must alter the moisture in the soil. And if you are dry farming, well, you accept that. If you're irrigating, then you turn it off. But have you noticed something different in terms of Pinot Noir soil, weather events, climate change? Natalie?
Yeah, well, I guess really along the sort of same lines as Jen, there hasn't been sort of a gradual shift that I can see. We're just, yeah, as you said, we're getting more extremes. Like 17, we struggled to get things ripe, and then we had pretty much a massive flood through the Aotearoa Valley, and I remember no one could get to work that day, but they let me through as long as I didn't open my car doors. Like the water was right up to my car doors on the state highway, and then going into sort of subsequent vintages, we're just getting sort of those hotter years. But yeah, it's just sort of all about management, and you get what you're given, and especially when you get heavy rains or you don't get rains in those critical sort of harvest windows, you just have to. That's all sort of the beauty of being a winemaker and in the industry. You're at the mercy of Mother Nature, and it's all part of the fun, part of the game, I guess.
Helen, any comment about that?
Yeah, it is really interesting. It's been fun looking back through, you know, the last 35, 38 years of vintage records. And one thing that's kind of become clearer is that often we feel like we're picking earlier, but if you look back 25 years ago, they picked on the same date. And often the brix was higher than we're getting now. So I think vine age is giving us the ability to pick, you know, at about, you know, what seems relatively early if you sometimes just think of the numbers, but at a much lower brix. So to me, I haven't quite got my head around it, but what I do know is that the earlier ripening sites we have are always our best fruit. And that sort of contradicts. People go, oh, do we need to go to a cooler site because of global warming? But actually, my sites that ripen first are always my best fruit. So I haven't got the answer yet, and I hope to be, you know, ask me again in another 20 years, and we'll see. But I think at the end of the day, it isn't a clear picture yet, and I think that's because we're so maritime influenced that New Zealand's not heating up at the same kind of consistent rate that Europe does, being such a big landmass.
Okay, we're actually at the end of this session, and there are a couple of questions that came through that we haven't addressed, but I'll make sure that they are post this session. Thank you to Jen Parr. Thank you to Dom Maxwell, thank you to Helen Masters, and thank you to Natalie Christensen for your insight, your knowledge. We certainly are on the cusp of change in New Zealand, with everything from a greater understanding of our soils and the influences that it has on viticulture. Pinot Noir is a very important variety for us here in New Zealand. And I think we've hopefully addressed all of those questions. I've certainly learned a lot just listening today. Kia kaha, go well, everybody. Hug somebody you love, even your cat, Nat, and take care, and we'll talk to you soon, yeah? Thank you so much for listening into the session. Have a fabulous day. Bye now.
Bye-bye.